enough evidence to suggest that the proportion of men that are illiterate is greater than the proportion of women. All right, so on the null hypothesis, you have to state that the two proportions would be equal. So the proportion of men would be equal to the proportion of women. The null hypothesis should always have an equal sign. This could be rewritten as the difference between the proportion of men minus the proportion of women that are illiterate would be equal to 0. The alternate hypothesis would be stating that they are not equal to each other. There is a claim that the men are more illiterate. So there is a hunch that tells me that the inequality symbol must be a greater than. The proportion of men minus the proportion of women that are illiterate is greater than 0. Another way of stating the alternate hypothesis. When creating the model, make sure you go through the assumptions and conditions as stated right here. The two samples were selected randomly. Independence, not only is each individual person not affecting each other person, whether or not they're literate or not, but the two groups were selected independent of each other. The sample of men and the sample of women were selected independently. The sample size being large enough is not just having a sample success greater than 10, but its success and the failure in this case would be the literate people, are greater than 10 in both samples. When setting up for the model for the hypothesis test, go through the conditions and assumptions. Random. Both samples were selected randomly as stated in the question. Independence. Not only is each person not affecting whether or not they are illiterate, but each group was selected independently of each other. The sample of men was selected independently from the sample of women. The sample size being large enough is showing that the success and failure for both groups, men and women, all had numbers greater than 10. And the last condition is the sample size can't be too large, the 10% condition. 234 men is less than 10% of the men of the population, and 250 women is also less than 10% of the entire population of the nation. Now in the mechanics, the sample size for the men was 234. The sample size for the women was 251. So the p hats, that would be 42 over 234. And that gives me a p hat men that are illiterate. Give me a moment. (17.9%). And for the women, there were 42 illiterate out of the sample of 251. It gives a p hat women 16.7% illiterate women. So the observed difference, which is also how I stated it up in the alternative hypothesis, nearly 18% men are literate, which is more than 16.7% illiterate women. Is that enough to suggest that men are more illiterate than women? Is that 1.2% difference random, or is that enough evidence to suggest that men are more illiterate than women?